In the quiet, tree-lined suburbs of Denver, Colorado, a morning routine was more than just a habit. It was a testament to a life built on order and precision. For David Sterling, a highly successful and meticulously organized corporate lawyer, his daily 6 a.m. run was the foundation of his day. It was a ritual that began on the dot, rain or shine, through the same peaceful streets of his affluent neighborhood. In the spring of 2006, as the first rays of sunlight slanted through the budding trees, this ritual was shattered, and with it, the perfect life he had so carefully constructed. On a crisp Tuesday morning, David laced up his new running shoes. His wife, Amelia, was still in bed, just stirring awake. He kissed her forehead, grabbed his water bottle, and stepped out the front door into the cool, pre-dawn air. He was a creature of habit, and his route was a familiar 5-mile loop. He was expected back by 6:45 a.m., just in time for a quick shower before his morning coffee and the long commute downtown. But at 6:45, the coffee machine stood unused. At 7 Amelia felt the first prickle of unease. By 7:30, unease had spiraled into a cold knot of dread in the pit of her stomach. She went to the front porch, half expecting to see him just rounding the corner. Instead, she found his running shoes and a half-full water bottle placed neatly on the welcome mat. They weren't there when he left. A frantic call to the police brought the first wave of sirens to the Sterling's pristine, manicured lawn. The initial search was a rapid, coordinated effort. Officers on foot and in patrol cars combed the 5-mile route he was known to take. They spoke to a handful of early risers, a dog walker, a paperboy, a neighbor getting her mail. No one had seen a man matching David's description. It was as if he had simply dissolved into the air. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no misplaced cell phone, just the quiet, terrifying void of nothingness. His personal life was scanned, his professional conduct reviewed. But David Sterling had no known enemies. He was a pillar of his community, a devoted husband, a respected lawyer. He had no hidden debts, no secret life, and no reason to run. The police found no motive, no suspect, no clue. The initial theory that he had suffered a medical emergency and fallen somewhere was quickly dismissed as the search broadened. Over the next few days, hundreds of volunteers joined the police, forming search lines that methodically swept through local parks and wooded areas. The local news ran his photo on a continuous loop. The image of a handsome, smiling man, a stark contrast to the growing sense of dread. The search was vast, but the city, with its intricate web of streets and alleys, held its secrets tight. It was a case without a body, a crime without a criminal. The void of his absence was a raw wound in the heart of a community that believed in order and logic. They were faced with a truth that defied both. A man had gone for a run and simply vanished without a trace. And the only thing left behind, a pair of running shoes on a porch, felt less like a clue and more like a cruel, impossible taunt. The city of Denver had gained a ghost, and the Sterling family was left to face an unimaginable and unending silence. A silence that would last for many years to come. The search for David Sterling quickly transitioned from a massive community effort to a cold, sterile investigation. The initial wave of frantic searching subsided, replaced by a haunting silence. The police, unable to find a single trace, were left with a case that seemed to defy all logic. There was no blood, no witness, no evidence of a break-in or a struggle. It was as if a man had simply ceased to exist. In the days that followed, the Sterling family home became the epicenter of a media frenzy. TV news vans lined the street, their satellite dishes pointed like hungry eyes toward the house. Reporters, microphones in hand, bombarded neighbors and friends with questions, trying to find a crack in the perfect facade of David's life. Amelia Sterling, thrust into the harsh glare of public scrutiny, was a portrait of anguish. Her grief was raw, unfiltered. She stood before the cameras, her voice trembling as she pleaded for any information, clinging to the fading hope that David was still out there. The public, captivated by the story of the successful lawyer who vanished, followed every development. But there were no developments. The police, in a desperate attempt to find a lead, meticulously searched David's life. His office was a monument to his profession, a place of order and success. His financial records were impeccable, his personal life an open book. There were no hidden affairs, no shady dealings, no secret accounts. Every door the police knocked on led to a dead end. As the days turned into weeks, the inevitable whispers began. In the absence of a clear motive or a perpetrator, the simplest and most painful theory began to take hold. Maybe David had left on his own. The idea was heartbreaking to Amelia. She vehemently dismissed it, her voice filled with a desperate certainty. "He would never abandon us," she told reporters, her eyes red from lack of sleep. "He loved his life. He loved our family." But the police, bound by procedure, had to consider every possibility. They released a statement saying there was no evidence of foul play, a phrase that, to a grieving wife, felt like an accusation. The theory of an intentional disappearance gained traction in the media, fueled by the public's desire to find a logical answer to an illogical event. As the summer of 2006 waned, so did the active investigation. The news vans eventually left, the reporters moving on to the next big story. The missing posters, once bright and hopeful, began to fade on telephone poles, their paper edges curling in the sun. The case moved from the front page of the newspapers to the back, and then off the pages entirely. David Sterling's story became a local ghost story, a cautionary tale whispered in the neighborhood. For Amelia and her family, the silence was deafening. The silence of an empty house, an unused coffee cup, an open door that no one would ever walk through again. The city, so vast and full of life, had a new ghost, and David Sterling was lost in its labyrinth of forgotten streets. The case went cold. For 17 long years, the mystery remained unsolved. A raw, open wound in the heart of a grieving family. But in the quiet, hidden arteries of the city, a tiny piece of the puzzle lay waiting. A perfect circle of gold in a world of decay and darkness. For 17 long years, the mystery of David Sterling's disappearance became a ghost story whispered in the suburbs of Denver. The search teams were disbanded. The case file was meticulously organized and stamped unsolved, and the once vibrant story faded into the archives of cold cases. Time, as it always does, marched on, leaving behind those who were still waiting. For Amelia Sterling, the passage of time was not a gradual process. It was a series of small, agonizing milestones. The first anniversary, the 10th, the day that would have been their 20th. Each year, the hope that had once been a blazing fire dwindled to a faint ember. She tried to move on, to build a new life in the shadow of the one she had lost. The house, once a home filled with the promise of a future, became an emotional prison. The familiar streets were a constant, painful reminder of the morning he vanished. The neighbor's kindness felt like pity, and the silence of his absence was a constant companion. A few years after he disappeared, Amelia made the difficult decision to sell the house. It was a move born of necessity, a way to put some distance between her and the raw, unhealing wound of memory. She moved to a new part of the city, a place with new streets, new faces, and new routines. But the void remained. The city of Denver itself changed around the Sterling case. Buildings were torn down and replaced with modern structures. The downtown corridor, where David had once worked, was now unrecognizable. The old storm drains and public works infrastructure, built decades ago, were due for maintenance and upgrades. It was a hidden world beneath the city's facade, a dark and forgotten network of tunnels and grates, a place where lost things went to disappear forever. No one ever thought to look for a missing person's clue in such a desolate and grim place. The city had moved on. The people had moved on. The case was no longer a headline. It was a line in a police database, a statistic among countless others. Detective Marcus Cole, the lead investigator on the original case, retired. He carried the Sterling file with him, a symbol of the one case he could never crack. He would occasionally pull it out, flipping through the pages of fruitless interviews and dead-end leads, a look of quiet frustration on his face. The file itself became a monument to what couldn't be solved. The Sterling case was a puzzle with a missing piece that no one knew how to find. It was a mystery that had been left to fester, its details forgotten by the public, But the city had a way of holding on to things, a secret underground world where lost items collected. And sometimes, in those forgotten places, things that were once thought to be lost forever were waiting for a new light to find them. It was in one of those dark, subterranean tunnels that a new story was about to begin. A city worker, performing a routine maintenance check on an old storm drain, was about to disturb the silent history of a case that had been buried for nearly 2 decades. He was about to find something that would tear open a long-healed wound and force the city to confront a ghost it had long forgotten. In the quiet, a new sound was about to echo through the forgotten tunnels, the sound of a small piece of metal clinking against the concrete, bringing with it a shockwave that would shake a family and a city to its core. The silence was about to be broken, and the truth, for a moment, was about to glint in the darkness. 17 years is a lifetime. It's enough time for a city to rebuild, for a new generation to grow up, for a case to be filed away and forgotten. But for Frank, a city maintenance worker with calloused hands and a deep knowledge of Denver's hidden underbelly, 17 years was just another day. His job was a monotonous cycle of clearing clogged drains, a battle against urban decay and forgotten debris. He was working in an older part of the city, a neighborhood that still held the ghosts of the past. As he lifted a heavy manhole cover, a stale gust of air escaped from the dark maw of the storm drain below. He descended into the tunnel, his flashlight beam cutting through the inky blackness. It was a routine job until his light caught a glint of gold. It wasn't a coin or a piece of discarded jewelry. It was a perfect, unbroken circle, half buried in a pile of sediment and grime. With a gloved hand, he reached down and carefully extracted it. The mud clung to it, but as he wiped it clean, its brilliant shine was revealed. It was a man's wedding band. Frank, a Denver native, felt a strange jolt of recognition, a memory from a long-ago news story. His breath hitched as he turned the ring over. The interior was engraved with 2 letters and a date, A&D 5/1898. The discovery felt like a punch to the gut. The sterling case was a local legend, a mystery that had gripped the city. The date on the ring, he knew from memory, corresponded to the wedding date that had been a part of every news report. This wasn't just a lost ring, it was a piece of a ghost story. Frank, now trembling with a mixture of disbelief and awe, climbed out of the drain and made a call to his supervisor, his voice strained with the weight of his find. The call was quickly transferred to the Denver Police Department's cold case unit. The dispatcher's initial skepticism was quickly replaced with a breathless urgency as Frank relayed the inscription. Within the hour, the old, forgotten stretch of street was sealed off. A new team of detectives, young men and women who were in elementary school when David Sterling disappeared, took over the scene. The atmosphere was a surreal mix of professionalism and raw excitement. This was a case they had studied in the academy, a symbol of the perfect crime. Now, they held the first piece of physical evidence in 17 years. The storm drain was meticulously photographed and documented. The ring, now a sacred artifact, was carefully packaged and sent to the lab for forensic analysis. It was a symbol of hope and possibly a key to a devastating truth. The news of the discovery leaked to the media like a tidal wave. The image of the ring, a small, shining circle of gold found in the decay of a storm drain, was broadcast on every news channel. The city of Denver collectively held its breath, reminded of the day a man went for a run and never came back. The Sterling case was no longer a ghost. It was a living, breathing mystery once more. For Amelia, now living a quiet life far from the suburbs, a phone call from a detective brought her world crashing down around her, this time not in grief, but in shock. A piece of her lost life had been found, and with it came a storm of emotion she thought she had long buried. The ring was the first clue, but it also opened a new can of worms. How did it end up in a storm drain in an area miles from David's known running route? The discovery raised more questions than it answered, and the case, once cold, was now on fire. A new and terrifying chapter waiting to be written. The moment the wedding ring was found, the cold case of David Sterling's disappearance was reborn. It was no longer a file gathering dust. It was a living, breathing investigation, a puzzle with its first piece finally in hand. The forensics lab received the ring as if it were a sacred artifact. Scientists, equipped with 17 years of technological advancements, began a meticulous analysis. They weren't looking for fingerprints, as the environment of a storm drain would have erased them long ago. Instead, they were searching for microscopic clues, traces of DNA, unique particles of sediment, or chemical residues that could tell a story. This tiny band of gold was a time capsule, a bridge between two eras of policing. Meanwhile, the storm drain and the 2-block radius around it were treated as a primary crime scene. Modern tools, like ground-penetrating radar, were used to search for any other buried evidence. The police were searching for answers to the most baffling question: how did the ring get there? The location was miles from David's known running route. This meant one of two things. Either David had been taken there against his will, or he had gone there for a reason no one could comprehend. The area was a disused industrial zone in 2006, a place no one would ever have reason to be during a morning run. The discrepancy was a chasm in the case, a gaping hole in a narrative that had been so perfectly simple. Amelia Sterling, who had spent nearly 2 decades coming to terms with the silence of her husband's absence, was now faced with a different kind of pain. The initial shock of the phone call had been replaced by a painful, renewed hope. She met with a new team of detectives, their young, eager faces a stark contrast to the world-weary detectives she had known before. They asked her to identify the ring, a formality she found heartbreaking. She held the small band in her hand, the engraved A&D, a ghost of a life she had long ago mourned. She was forced to recount the day of his disappearance in excruciating detail, revisiting the small, mundane actions that preceded the void. The memories, once faded, now came back with a vivid, terrifying clarity. The new investigation started from scratch, but with the benefit of hindsight. The new detectives pored over the old case files, now with the knowledge that David had not simply vanished from his running route. The focus shifted from "where did he go?" to "how did this ring get here, and what does it tell us about the person who took it there?" They brought in retired Detective Marcus Cole, the original lead investigator. He sat in a conference room, his eyes scanning the new evidence photos, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. The file he had carried with him for years, a monument to his failure, was now alive. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that this find meant the truth was far more sinister than a simple disappearance. This was a crime with a careful, hidden orchestration. As the days turned into weeks, the police waited for the forensics report to come back from the lab. They had exhausted all logical theories for the ring's presence in the storm drain. The case, once a symbol of a man swallowed by thin air, was now a portrait of a deliberate act. The ring was the first and only clue in a crime that had been frozen in time for 17 years. It was a beacon in the darkness, but it led to more questions than answers. The lab technician called the lead detective with the results, her voice hushed with the weight of her discovery. The ring didn't have any DNA, but it did have something else, something far more unusual. It contained a microscopic trace of a substance, a chemical that would connect the ring not to a person, but to a specific place, an unexpected and shocking new lead that no one could have ever predicted. The call from the forensics lab was the most important development in the David Sterling case in 17 years. The lead detective listened intently, his pen scribbling notes as the technician explained the findings. The microscopic substance found on the wedding ring was not DNA, but a highly specific chemical compound. It was a unique industrial solvent, a type of solvent used almost exclusively in auto body repair shops in the early to mid-2000s to strip paint and prepare metal surfaces. It was, in effect, a geographical and professional fingerprint, a silent clue that had traveled for 17 years, waiting to be found. This discovery changed everything. The investigation was no longer a fruitless search for a body or a witness on a running trail. It was a hunt for a place. The new cold case team began a meticulous and grueling task, cross-referencing every auto body shop and industrial garage that operated in the greater Denver area in 2006. This was not a job for computers. It was a job for dusty city records, old business licenses, and yellowed tax documents. They worked for weeks, sifting through mountains of paperwork, their search narrowing from a city to a specific industry, and from a list of hundreds to a handful of possibilities. The process was slow, methodical, and painfully analog, a stark contrast to the high-tech science that had given them the lead. The list was eventually whittled down to just 5 auto shops that had closed or changed ownership in the months following David Sterling's disappearance. 3 were eliminated due to logistical reasons. One had been sold to a large corporation, with all its original equipment and chemicals disposed of. The second had burned down in an electrical fire. The third, a smaller operation, had simply moved. But the fourth, a small independent shop called Donovan's Auto Works, had been abruptly and mysteriously abandoned in late 2006. Its owner, a man named Lyle Donovan, had seemingly vanished. He had not sold the business, not filed for bankruptcy, and left no forwarding address. The closure was sudden, suspicious, and, to the new detectives, a very strong red flag. They pulled the original Sterling file to see if there was any connection to Lyle Donovan. A client? A disgruntled acquaintance? There was nothing. The names had never crossed paths. This suggested something far more sinister than a personal vendetta. It hinted at a random opportunity-based crime, or a crime so carefully hidden that the 2 lives never appeared to intersect. The lack of a direct link made the case even more chilling. They were chasing a phantom, a man who had vanished just as completely as David Sterling. But the microscopic residue on the ring was their guide. The police secured a warrant to search the abandoned auto shop. The address was now a desolate, boarded-up building in a forgotten industrial park. It was a place where things went to die. The detectives arrived at the old shop. The windows were boarded up. The door was padlocked with a thick chain. The air was thick with the smell of rust and stale gasoline. As they cut the lock and pushed the heavy door open, a cloud of dust billowed into the air, stirred by the first human presence in nearly 2 decades. The inside was a time capsule, a frozen moment in 2006. Tools lay on a workbench, covered in a thick layer of dust. The ghost of a life's work was everywhere. The detectives, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, moved slowly and deliberately. They were about to uncover the truth. A truth that had been buried not in the ground, but in the silence of an abandoned building. The ring had led them to a place. Now, they were about to find out if it would lead them to an answer. The silence inside the abandoned auto shop was heavy with a history no one had seen. Dust motes danced in the single beam of sunlight cutting through a hole in the boarded-up windows, illuminating a scene frozen in 2006. The detectives moved through the space with grim determination, their flashlights sweeping over dusty tools and empty oil drums. The air was thick with the scent of forgotten grease and rust, a sensory link to the world that had existed here almost 2 decades ago. They searched every corner, every toolbox, every dusty workbench. This was not a quick search. It was a forensic excavation of the past. The office, a small enclosed room off the main garage floor, was their next target. The door was unlocked, a sign that its owner had left in a hurry. Inside, the space was small and cramped. A desk covered in old invoices and a filing cabinet were the only furniture. The detectives began to sift through the files, but they found nothing that connected Lyle Donovan to David Sterling. It was as if their 2 lives had been completely separate. That is, until one of the detectives noticed something unusual. Tucked away under a loose floorboard near the desk was a small, tarnished metal lockbox. They pried the lockbox open. The contents inside were a gut punch. Lying among Lyle Donovan's personal documents, an old passport, a few bank statements, were a handful of personal items that had never been found at the Sterling home. There was David's wallet, the leather faded and water-damaged, containing his driver's license and a few business cards. Next to it was his cell phone, a bulky 2006 model, its screen shattered. The phone had a small running armband attached, the kind David wore on his morning jogs. This was the smoking gun. The discovery proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that David Sterling was not a runaway. He had been a victim. He had been taken from his running route and brought to this very shop. But the most chilling discovery lay just outside the office. In a forgotten corner of the garage, shielded from view by a rack of old tires, was a large, empty metal drum. Its interior was clean, scrubbed with a corrosive acid to erase any trace of its contents, but a faint metallic odor lingered. The investigators' eyes locked. The look of cold dread passed between them. They knew what a drum like that could be used for. They had found not only a crime scene but also a likely location for the disposal of a body. The lack of a body was no longer a sign of a perfect disappearance. It was proof of a carefully planned and executed crime. The new detectives immediately called the retired Detective Cole. He arrived at the scene, a ghostly figure from the original investigation. As he looked at the items from the lockbox, a look of profound sorrow and vindication crossed his face. The file he had carried for 17 years was no longer a mystery. It was a solved crime. They had a motive. Whatever it was in that room. They had a suspect, Lyle Donovan, and they had a crime scene, the very place they were standing. But they still had a ghost, Lyle Donovan. He had vanished almost as completely as his victim. The police now had 2 missing people, and the case of David Sterling was inextricably linked to the unknown fate of the man who had taken his life. The new lead was powerful, but it was 17 years too late. A massive manhunt for Lyle Donovan, dead or alive, was about to begin. The ghost in the machine was no longer a ghost. He was a murderer. Part 8. The Ghost Hunt. The moment the warrant for Lyle Donovan's arrest was issued, the case of David Sterling became something entirely different. The city was no longer searching for a missing man. It was hunting a known murderer. A new Most Wanted bulletin was sent out, the grainy driver's license photo of Lyle from 2006, a chilling contrast to the present day. He was a man frozen in time, a phantom on a page, and the police knew they were 17 years late. The initial manhunt was swift and exhaustive, but it quickly became a lesson in frustration. Lyle Donovan, they soon discovered, was a master of living off the grid. He had no social media presence, no credit history since late 2006, and no known family or friends he had kept in contact with. His life was a simple, cash-based existence. He paid for everything in cash, and his tax records were minimal. He had been, in every sense of the word, a ghost, long before the police ever came looking. The trail of his disappearance was just as cold and lifeless as David Sterling's had been. The new detectives were faced with a grim reality. They had a suspect, a motive, and a crime scene, but they had no idea where he was, or even if he was still alive. The lack of a body was a maddening void in a case that had otherwise been blown wide open. With no physical body and no new leads on Lyle Donovan, the investigation shifted back to the auto shop. The police, armed with the theory of the metal drum, brought in cadaver dogs and a new team of forensic experts to comb the area. They used ground-penetrating radar to search for any signs of a body buried on or near the property. They scoured the industrial park, the surrounding wooded areas, and even the nearby river, all with the same result: nothing. The absence of a body meant they had no definitive proof of a murder, only a strong case based on circumstantial evidence. It was a killer's ultimate weapon, a victim who could never be found. The media, now in a frenzy, broadcast the details of the case to a captivated nation. People saw the face of the man who likely took David Sterling's life, and they were horrified. A faceless, unknown crime had been given a face, and it was the face of a man who had been a ghost for nearly 2 decades. For Amelia Sterling, the discovery of Lyle Donovan was a storm of conflicting emotions. The terrible truth of her husband's murder was confirmed, but she was now left with the agonizing knowledge that his killer was a ghost. Her grief was no longer a silent pain. It was a burning need for justice, a desperate hope that this man could be found, even after all this time. The public clamored for answers, for justice, for a final end to a story that had been a part of their collective consciousness for so long. The manhunt, however, had hit a wall. Every lead went nowhere. The police were about to scale back the active search, fearing that Lyle Donovan, like David Sterling, was just another phantom of the city's past. But just as hope began to fade, a new tip came in from an unexpected source. An elderly man, a former employee of Lyle's, living in a retirement home, saw the news report. He remembered something about a special job that Lyle had mentioned shortly before he disappeared. He remembered something that could finally provide the last piece of the puzzle. He remembered a name. The unexpected tip from a retired auto worker named Thomas was the most significant breakthrough since the discovery of the ring itself. Thomas, now in his 80s, with a mind that held on to small details from decades past, sat across from the new detectives in the hushed quiet of a retirement home. His memory was a patchwork, but when asked about Lyle Donovan, one memory stood out with a startling clarity: a special job that Lyle had mentioned shortly before he disappeared. Thomas recounted the story of a client who had come to the shop, not for a routine repair, but for a full, custom restoration. The client was an older man, wealthy and meticulous. He wanted a vintage car restored in complete secrecy, with no paperwork and no questions asked. He paid Lyle a substantial sum in cash up front. Thomas didn't know the client's name, but he remembered the car. It was a rare, beautiful vintage automobile, a 1968 Pontiac Firebird. He remembered it because it was so unique, a car that had no business being in a rundown shop like Donovan's Auto Works. The job had gone on for weeks, and Lyle had become increasingly secretive and obsessed with it. Then, suddenly, the car was gone, and soon after, Lyle vanished. The detectives' minds raced. A 1968 Pontiac Firebird. They knew, from their meticulous review of the Sterling case files, that David Sterling did not own such a car. The lead seemed to be a dead end, but they dug deeper. They went back to the original files, this time focusing on David's family and social life, a part of the investigation that had been brief and dismissed 17 years ago. They found a small note, almost a footnote, in a police interview with David's father. He mentioned that his most prized possession was a restored 1968 Pontiac Firebird. He was a retired car collector, and the vehicle was a source of immense pride. The detective's breath hitched. The pieces began to fall into place. This was not a random crime. It was a targeted abduction. Lyle Donovan, a struggling small business owner, had taken on a restoration job for a man of great wealth. He must have learned of the Sterling family's affluence through the father, and perhaps even learned about the son, a successful lawyer who ran the same route every day. The plan was likely an abduction for ransom, an opportunistic crime fueled by greed. But something went wrong. David Sterling vanished, Lyle Donovan vanished, and the car was sold by the grieving Sterling family to a private collector. The police had a clear motive and a chilling new theory. They were now looking for a car, a ghost from the past, that could provide the final devastating clue. The search for the 1968 Pontiac Firebird began. It was a monumental task, but with the help of car collector databases and a few key sources, they traced the vehicle's ownership to a reclusive, wealthy man who had a private car collection on a large estate outside the city. They secured a warrant, and with a new sense of urgency, they headed out to the estate. They were about to come face to face with the final piece of evidence, a clue that had been hidden in plain sight for 17 years. The truth was no longer a ghost. It was a ghost in the machine, and they were about to find it. The reclusive car collector's estate was a stark contrast to the grime of the auto shop. It was a sprawling, immaculate sanctuary of wealth, where priceless vintage cars were kept in a climate-controlled garage, each one a monument to a bygone era. The detectives, in their grim, dark suits, felt like intruders. The owner, a man with a look of entitled annoyance, led them into the pristine showroom. They moved past gleaming fenders and chrome finishes, their eyes fixed on a single car. A flawless 1968 Pontiac Firebird, its deep red paint shining under the bright lights. The forensic search of the vehicle was painstaking. Every seam, every screw, every piece of upholstery was examined. The owner watched with a confused indignation, unable to comprehend why his prized possession was being treated as a crime scene. The detectives were looking for a clue that had been hidden in plain sight for 17 years. They suspected Lyle Donovan had used the car for more than just a restoration project. They were right. A small, unlisted compartment in the car's undercarriage, part of a custom frame rebuild that had never been documented, yielded its secret.
Inside, wrapped in a plastic bag to protect it from moisture, was a small, outdated micro SD card. It was a time capsule, and it was about to reveal a truth that had been buried for nearly 2 decades. Back at the precinct, a forensic tech struggled to access the data on the old card. The technology was nearly obsolete, but after hours of work, the screen flickered to life. The contents were a series of short, shaky videos.
The first video was dated just a few days after David Sterling's disappearance. It was a close-up of a terrified man's face, and as the camera pulled back, the detectives saw the face of Lyle Donovan. His eyes were wide with a mix of fear and manic obsession. He began to speak, his voice a low, frantic confession. He detailed the plan, the abduction for ransom. But something had gone horribly wrong. He had been so close, so careful. But David had struggled, and in the panicked chaos of the moment, Lyle had accidentally killed him. The videos continued, a macabre narrative of a man's unraveling. Lyle, in a state of sheer panic, explained how he had hidden the body in the auto shop's metal drum, waited for the cover of night, and then drove it to a place he was sure no one would ever look. He talked about how he had cleaned the shop, sold off the car, and then simply disappeared, hoping no one would ever connect him to the crime. The final video was the most devastating of all. It was a wide shot of a remote, wooded area, somewhere far from Denver. Lyle, with a shovel in his hand, stood next to a freshly dug grave. The video ended with a slow pan to a distinctive landmark. A lone, twisted old oak tree, its branches gnarled and reaching toward the sky. The tree was the marker. The grave was real. For the first time in 17 years, the police knew exactly where David Sterling was. The mystery was no longer a matter of where he had gone, but where he had been all along. The final, brutal truth had been found not in a storm drain or a dusty workshop, but in a small digital file hidden in plain sight. The case that had haunted the city for 2 decades was no longer a ghost. It was a body, and the police were about to bring David Sterling home. The grainy, pixelated video on the micro SD card was a map to a burial. It provided a location and a landmark, a solitary, gnarled old oak tree standing in a remote, wooded area far from the bustle of Denver. For the first time in 17 years, the search for David Sterling was not an act of hope, but one of grim certainty. A new search party was assembled, a mix of young, modern detectives and veteran officers who had been on the original search. The retired Detective Cole, a ghost of the past himself, insisted on being there, a silent witness to the conclusion he had spent a career chasing. The drive was long, taking them far from the urban sprawl of the city and deep into a secluded, unfamiliar landscape. The GPS coordinates from the video's metadata led them to a winding dirt road, and from there, a long trek through thick brush and over rocky terrain. As they neared the location, a hushed reverence fell over the group. The lone, twisted old oak tree, its branches reaching like skeletal fingers, was exactly as it had appeared in Lyle Donovan's video. Underneath it, the ground was disturbed in a way only a professional eye would recognize, the shallow grave now a subtle depression in the earth. The silence was broken only by the rhythmic rustle of the wind and the quiet hum of a distant highway. The dig began with a quiet, somber determination. The earth, now loose and soft from decades of erosion, gave way easily. As they got deeper, the air grew thick with a cold, metallic scent. Then, a detective's shovel struck something solid. The grim work of excavation began. This was not a frenzied search. It was a delicate, respectful act. They were not looking for a body. They were bringing a man home. They found the remains, partially mummified by the dry soil, and with them, a few personal items that had never been found. A stainless steel watch, its face shattered, and a small leather wallet. Inside the wallet, the ID photo of David Sterling was intact, a young man smiling, a face frozen in time. The call to Amelia Sterling was the most difficult of all. A young detective, his voice strained with the weight of the moment, delivered the news. Amelia, who had spent so long living with a ghost, was now faced with a brutal, undeniable truth. There was no more mystery. There was no more waiting. The man she had mourned for 17 years was finally found. Her husband, David, was no longer a ghost of the city. He was a body, and a case that had haunted a city was finally, tragically, solved. The news broke like a tidal wave. David Sterling's body, found after 17 years. The headlines screamed. The city of Denver, which had long since moved on, was gripped by a sense of shock and profound relief. A legend had been put to rest. But the case was not yet over. The confession video explained what Lyle Donovan did, but it didn't say where he was now. The police had the body, the motive, and the confession. But the killer was still a ghost. The final hunt was about to begin, and this time, it would be a race against time, a final desperate chase for justice. With David Sterling's remains found and a confession on video, the manhunt for Lyle Donovan was no longer a cold case. It was a race to bring a murderer to justice. The stakes were higher now. The new team of detectives, armed with technology that didn't exist in 2006, began a final, desperate hunt. The key to their search was the confession video itself. They analyzed it not just for content, but for every hidden detail. A team of forensic analysts ran the grainy footage through high-end software, cleaning up the blur and enhancing the shadows. They were looking for something, anything, that could give them a new lead. Their first breakthrough came from the audio. A sound engineer, listening to the ambient noise in the background of Lyle's video, picked up a low-frequency hum, a subtle, rhythmic sound that was barely audible under Lyle's frantic monologue. It was a unique signature, a sound that the engineer's database identified as belonging to a very specific, very old type of industrial machinery, an ancient generator from a series of factories that had been decommissioned decades ago. Only a handful of these machines still existed, primarily in old, forgotten industrial zones in the American Midwest. This was the break the police had been waiting for. The wedding ring had led them to an industry. The confession video led them to a region. The detectives now had a new mission. They would cross-reference the locations of these old factories with any public records, however small, from the last 17 years. The work was painstaking, but after days of sifting through old business licenses and employee databases, a name appeared. One of the factories, located in a desolate industrial town in Ohio, had an old-age pension file for a man who had worked there as a security guard for 10 years. His name, Lyle Donovan. They found a photo in the file, a much older version of the man in the video. But it was him. The geographical link was a chilling new development. Lyle had not just vanished. He had moved to a new life, a new state, a new existence. He had slipped back into the shadows, a ghost in a new town, thinking he had escaped his past. He had likely used his old, cash-based habits to live a quiet life, earning just enough to get by as a security guard in a deserted factory, a man living in the past, just like the machinery he was guarding. The police now had a physical address and a new lead. They had to act fast. They coordinated with local police in Ohio, sharing the video confession and the details of the new lead. This wasn't a manhunt for a missing person anymore. It was an interstate hunt for a confirmed murderer. The hunt had come full circle. It had started with a man on a run and ended with a man guarding a forgotten past. The police had a location. They were about to raid the old factory, but they still had to ask themselves, would they find Lyle Donovan, or would he once again have vanished, leaving behind only another ghost? The final chase was about to begin, and a final, shocking revelation awaited them. Under the cold, pale moonlight, the abandoned factory in Ohio stood as a monument to a forgotten industry and a hidden life. The police raid was a quiet, methodical operation. Local officers, alongside the Denver detectives, surrounded the building. The air was thick with tension, a tangible feeling of 17 years of waiting and searching, all culminating in this one moment. They cut the padlock on a side door and slipped inside, their flashlights cutting through the inky blackness. The stale air, thick with the smell of rust and dust, hung heavy around them. They moved with a tactical precision, their guns drawn, their eyes scanning for any sign of movement. They found him in a small, cramped office in the back. Lyle Donovan was no longer the man in the 2006 photo. He was an old man, gaunt and frail, with a shock of white hair and eyes that held the ghosts of his past. He sat at a small, rickety desk, a single light bulb hanging overhead, his face illuminated by the glow of a small, old-fashioned television set. He didn't try to run. He didn't try to resist. He simply looked up at them, a faint, almost relieved expression on his face. The long hunt was over. He was a ghost no longer. Taken into custody and brought in for questioning, Lyle Donovan confessed to everything. His voice was tired but steady, filling in the gaps that the video confession had left open. He confirmed the motive. He had intended to kidnap David Sterling for ransom, a desperate, greedy act to solve his financial problems. But during the struggle, as David fought back, a moment of panic had taken over. He had hit David, and David fell, hitting his head on the hard pavement. He was dead instantly. Lyle panicked. The ransom plan had evaporated, replaced by a desperate need to cover up his crime. He described in chilling detail how he had hidden David's body in the metal drum in his shop, and then, under the cover of darkness, drove it to the remote, wooded area from the video. He had buried David, and in a final act of a man trying to sever all ties to his crime, he had walked back to the street, and in a moment of panic, threw David's wedding ring into a nearby storm drain. He had no idea the ring would be found. He had assumed it would be lost forever. He had been a coward, he said, and he had spent the last 17 years hiding, a ghost in a new town, a man who had traded one life for another, haunted by the one he had taken. The police had their man. The investigation was officially closed. They had the body, the confession, and the killer. The long 17-year hunt for David Sterling was finally over. The case that had captivated the city of Denver was solved. The feeling was a mixture of triumph and sorrow, a grim sense of finality. But the story was not yet complete. The long, painful road to justice remained, and the lives that had been torn apart by David Sterling's disappearance now had to confront a new, painful chapter. The trial of Lyle Donovan and the final emotional conclusion of this 2-decade-long mystery were about to begin. With Lyle Donovan's confession and the recovery of David Sterling's remains, the long and agonizing journey to justice was short. The prosecution had an airtight case, built on a mountain of evidence spanning 17 years. The wedding ring, the personal belongings from the abandoned shop, the digital confession on the micro SD card, and the full testimony from the killer himself. Lyle Donovan, a man who had already spent nearly 2 decades as a ghost, chose to plead guilty. He spared the Sterling family the pain of a long, drawn-out trial, and in doing so, offered a final small act of decency. At the sentencing hearing, Amelia Sterling stood before the court. She was no longer a young woman in the throes of a desperate public plea. She was a woman of quiet strength, her face etched with the lines of sorrow and resilience. She chose to give a victim impact statement, not to seek vengeance, but to tell the story that had been a silent weight on her soul for half of her life. She spoke of the day David vanished, of the empty house, the unanswered phone calls, and the agonizing limbo of not knowing. She spoke of the endless nights spent staring at the ceiling, wondering if he was alive, if he was in pain, if he was thinking of her. It was a powerful and haunting testimony, a searing indictment not just of the crime, but of the cruel, unending silence it left behind. The judge, moved by her words, passed down a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Justice, a word that had seemed abstract for so long, was finally served. Lyle Donovan was led away, a man who had stolen a life and had his own life stolen by a crime he thought he had escaped. The city of Denver, which had lived with the Sterling mystery for so long, could finally exhale. The case was a monument to the tireless work of a new generation of detectives and a testament to the fact that no matter how much time passes, the truth can still be found. For Amelia, the legal resolution was not an end, but a new beginning. She could finally grieve. The memorial service that she was unable to hold 17 years ago was finally planned. It was a small, private affair, attended by a few close friends and family. It was a day of tears, but they were tears of sorrow mixed with a sense of profound relief. David Sterling was finally laid to rest, not as a missing person, but as a man who had lived and loved. The wedding ring, the object that had started the entire journey, was returned to her. It was no longer a piece of evidence, a symbol of a crime. It was a symbol of love, of a past that was now fully understood, and a future that she could now begin to build. The ghost in her life was gone, and for the first time in 17 years, she could look at the past, not as a void, but as a finished story. The trial of Lyle Donovan was a final act of justice, a period on a sentence that had been agonizingly long. But even with the conviction, the story of David Sterling did not simply end. It became a permanent fixture in the annals of Denver's history, a case study for future generations of detectives. The discovery of a single wedding ring in a storm drain after 17 years became a powerful symbol, a lesson in the unyielding nature of forensic science and the persistence of memory. Cold case units across the country began to re-examine old evidence with a new eye, hoping that a single forgotten clue might be a time capsule of its own, waiting for the right moment and the right technology. The ghost of David Sterling became a beacon of hope for countless other families of missing persons, a sign that the silence of an empty home does not have to be permanent. Lyle Donovan, the man who had traded one life for another, now faced a new kind of solitude. He was a prisoner, no longer a ghost but a man trapped by his own past. He had confessed, not out of remorse, but out of a quiet, weary acceptance that his time was up. His life of quiet desperation continued, but it was now confined by walls and bars. He became a forgotten footnote in the case, his name a mere detail in a long, detailed file. The man who had outsmarted a city for 17 years was finally caught, and his life, once a blank canvas of anonymity, was now a portrait of a criminal, defined by the one act he had desperately tried to bury. And then there was Amelia. She had walked through the fire and emerged on the other side, not whole, but healed. The return of David's wedding ring was a moment of profound closure, a small, tangible piece of a man who had existed and loved. She wore it now, not on her finger, but on a chain around her neck, a silent reminder of the journey she had taken. She learned to live again, not in the shadow of David's disappearance, but in the light of her own strength. She became a vocal advocate for missing persons, her story a testament to the endurance of the human spirit. She had a new purpose, a new reason to wake up in the morning, a life that was finally her own. She was no longer a widow defined by a void, but a woman defined by her resilience. The case of the lawyer who vanished during his morning run is a haunting reflection on the nature of our lives and the silent places where our pasts are buried. It was a story not about finding a ghost, but about a family that was lost, a city that was haunted, and a criminal who thought he had escaped. The storm drain, the wedding ring, the abandoned shop, the confession video, and the final discovery, each was a piece of the puzzle, a breadcrumb trail that led to a final, brutal truth. The story of David Sterling is a reminder that some stories never truly end. They just find a new form, an unending echo in the world of the living. In a city so vast, filled with so many lives and so many secrets, how many other truths are waiting, just beneath the surface, for a new light to find them? And in the long silence of an unsolved mystery, is hope a beautiful thing or a cruel punishment?